for global struggles for fiscal justice. My name is Ignacio Saiz. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights. I'm delighted to welcome you all today. Just a reminder that we have interpretation for this event from and into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Some of our panelists will speak in Spanish, others in English, and I may speak in both, depending on who I'm speaking to. We will have a visual rapporteur for this event, Andrea Molina, who we will see her work at the end of today. This event is the culmination of a week of activities marking the launch of the Principles for Human Rights in Fiscal Policy. This is a new normative instrument developed by a coalition of human rights and fiscal justice organizations across Latin America, who are the co-hosts of this event and the events of the week. And the aim of the principles is to bring human rights accountability into the sphere of tax and budget policymaking. We're really thrilled to have with us today some of the leading figures from the international human rights and tax justice movements. And they're going to help us explore the relevance of these principles to global struggles for human rights and fiscal justice, including and particularly in the context of efforts to bring about a just economic recovery from COVID-19. From the field of human rights, we will hear from Gaby Oré Aguilar, one of the founders or originators of this initiative in her former capacity as Deputy Executive Director of CSR. We will hear from Soledad García Muñoz, who is the Special Rapporteur on Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights of the InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights. And we will hear from Olivier de Schutter, who is the UN's Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. From the tax field, from the tax justice field, we're honored to have Irene Ovonji-Odida, who is a member of not one, but two high-level panels, the Independent Commission on the Reform of Corporate Taxation. I hope I've remembered that right. It's a very difficult title to remember, ICRICT, and the FACTI panel. We have Derege Alemayehu, who is Executive Coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And we have Alex Cobham, who is Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network. Now, although I've presented them as being from different fields, what's remarkable, I think, about all our panelists is how they've crossed from one field into the other, bringing their unique expertise to build an increasing convergence between these two movements and indeed beyond the human rights and tax justice movement to include other social movements and civil society sectors. Now, the principles, as we know, have originated in Latin America for reasons that we're going to explore in this panel. It's the world's most unequal region, we all know that, but it's also the region where the role where the convergence between fiscal justice and human rights activism has had the deepest roots, perhaps because it's where the role of fiscal policy in combating inequality is most widely recognized. Yet the objectives of the principles are universally relevant. They aim to clarify the concrete implications of human rights norms for fiscal policymakers, but they also aim to provide civil society activists with a tool, with a practical tool, for holding policymakers to account. And more broadly, they aim to shift the narrative on what the economy is for, how decisions around public resources can be democratized. So this session will explore the usefulness of the new principles in advancing human rights and tax justice agendas beyond the region of Latin America, and the role that international human rights bodies, fiscal oversight panels, and more broadly advocacy networks can play in leveraging the principles most effectively. So I'm going to pass now into Spanish. Gaby.
Gaby. So I'd like to start by asking you, why has this initiative started in Latin American region, and how have the promoters seen the global relevance, the global meaning of this regional initiative?
Muchas gracias, Ignacio. Un placer.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Why did this happen in Latin America? Well, this initiative started in Latin America because of organizations being convinced that tax policy had a central role to face the structural problems that you have already mentioned during introduction: socioeconomic inequality, is focusing wealth in only some, and there was an instrument missing, an instrument that would make it possible to have a clearer application of regional standards of human rights to the environment and to the field of tax policy. But also, there were other conditions that contributed to the decision of implementing this initiative. And I'm going to stress on three of them. The first one is that there was an ecosystem of social movements and organizations that were very experienced and quite capable to address tax policy situations. There was human rights organizations being created, and for many years they had been questioning justice of resources distribution through budget analysis, through access to tax collection, etc., that had attempted the jurisprudence wealth in the national environment. There were important decisions in national courts that had the potential to enrich in national standards related to human rights. On the other hand, there were also networks dedicated to tax justice throughout the region that had been pioneer in the approach of tax policy from the field of economy and development. So there was an ecosystem that was a very important condition. In the second factor that I find quite important to stress is the existence of social movements and women's movements and indigenous movements of young people, including young people, people with disabilities, that started questioning directly not only the scarcity of financial resources, but also the unequal impact of tax policies throughout the region. So there was a discussion and an active collaboration in tax movements and human rights in particular. So the initiative is consolidated at a time where there was a synergy in the agendas of these movements, tax justice movements, including, let's say, the language and the discourse of human rights in their agendas, and human rights organizations, including tax policy, with their own. And the third factor that was determinant in the decision to start this initiative throughout the region was how receptive the Inter-American system of human rights was in order to address the control of public policies in social and economic matters. In 2015, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, for the first time, allowed to have an audience to analyze tax policy from the perspective of human rights, which was requested by CESR and by the organizations that are part of this initiative. Now, this effort met and coincided with the transformation of the former desk unit in the special rapporteur of the Social and Cultural Commission, that is by Soledad Muñoz, and we are very fortunate to have her in the panel today. So I would say that these are the other contexts that determined the decision to start with this collective effort. The second part of your question was related to the way in which we were considering the global meaning and the possible global impact of the principles. From the beginning, the initiative aimed to be global. And it is evident that as of the creation of this idea, which started during an oval meeting between Latin American societies and other regions in Lima, for example, in 2015. So out of this meeting, of this global meeting, there was a Lima Declaration, which is a creation that establishes and places principles and guidelines that were further developed during the principles and guidelines effort. So we always believe that in the principles developed in Latin America, they could contribute to accountability, not only for tax policy, but also they had the potential to act as a resource and feed international standards of human rights in terms of tax policies. So, of course, developing the potential of this global input will require a sustainable effort, both from civil society as well as human rights system. So, last but not least, the most affected people and communities by tax abuse and tax injustice, they are in the global south, and organizations and movements of these regions are the ones that have been called to build instruments and provide experience in the creation of solutions for these problems affecting human rights in a global field. And that'll be all for now. Great, Gabby. Thank you so much. I would like to remind you that this strategy that happened in Lima in 2015 that you are referring to was organized in CSR along with Tax Justice Network and the Tax Justice Global Network, like TINDAD, the Network for Tax Justice, and many of us here have been here throughout the week. Soledad, Gabby has talked about how the Inter-American system has been receptive enough and has acted as one of the players that made this initiative possible, you know? So what do you think could be the most significant input of these principles that have been created this week to the efforts that have been carried forward in the Inter-American system, specifically in the DESCA, in order to link tax policies and human rights? Thank you so much, Ignacio. First of all, good morning, everyone. Good day, everyone. I'm so glad to be able to see you at least online. I'm so glad to be with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me to this closed-out panel on the week of human rights and tax justice. So as you know, it celebrates this initiative as well as the principles that I truly welcome. And I'm very glad to see it disseminated. There is usefulness of these principles for the Inter-American system. And thank you, Gabby, for discussing how open the system has been, because it is very important to acknowledge it and, of course, to have it, for it to exist. So this usefulness is manifested in the technical field in terms of, as you very well said it, Ignacio, the principles and guidelines clarify an overview that's not as evident for the community considered within human rights. There is still a very large separation between economy, human rights. I think that a great virtue from this tool that you and your alliance have promoted is the ability to explain what is this connection, this relationship that cannot be dissolved between economy and human rights. So, of course, there is a technical, legal value that's quite important for the Inter-American system as well as the international one, and for the national human rights protection systems as well as the economic systems and national and international economic players and actors. On the other hand, I would like to add that there is a virtuous circle and an advocacy we already had along with the initiative in the recent series of sessions within the Commission, we had a very interesting work session with the Commission's member, where experts having worked in these principles introduced them to the Commission, and the Commission was fully receptive, interested in them, and in considering the opportunity to apply their context in the different mechanisms of the Commission and our daily job. So due to the opportunity that came from a very consolidated alliance between all of the organizations that are part of these initiatives and ourselves, especially the Technical Secretariat, the CERS, I see that the principles have started providing very good results, being fruitful, which has to do with the agenda of my mandate, which of course considers them utterly important to change our work, the way it develops within these same competencies and its same line of thought. So I have already started my second mandate period, and we have a new strategic agenda, the Redesca, which is a revised version of the original mandate, which has a very clearly identified priority that's related to tax, justice, and human rights, as well as everything related to corruption and human rights. So the Commission is working more and more in these topics. And it has to do, as we all know, with resources available needed for the development of the human rights and for any human rights, actually. And as Gavi very well said, it has to do with regions that are the most unequal in the world. So at Redesca, we want to establish discussions, conversations between economic and human rights bodies, more powerful conversations, so we can act as bridges between both worlds in terms of 2030 agenda and tax matters. So this is why the principle and guidelines in our alliance are very important, considering that it is quite urgent to connect tax and economic policies of the states, as well as the companies, with obligations as a result of InterAmerican international legal framework. I have other ideas to share. However, I will do it in the second round of my intervention, so I can provide the opportunity of my colleagues to also share. Thank you, Soledad. Well, this input, this technical value, this advocacy value, this clarifying value that you mentioned, of course, it has a usefulness beyond the region. So a very quick follow-up question. What is the role that the Inter-American system, and more specifically Redesca, with the new roles, what role could it carry out in order to help universalizing these standards that, as Gavi said, they always had a global or universal calling? Well, thank you so much for this follow-up question, which is very important. Well, yes, these principles today, in these times where we are identifying a strategic line of work in a context that demands it, a context of pandemic, of climate emergency, a context and crisis, inequality that's deeper and deeper, and with very clear damage to women. I was just going over an ECLAC report that explains how inequality and poverty are escalating massively in our region in terms to women's and other collective groups in vulnerable situations. So in this sense, due to the work carried out by organizations such as themselves, and as it has been mentioned, the Commission started receiving a new comprehensive view of human rights based on indivisibility contexts, interdependency, interrelation, and intersectionality, of course. So the Commission and my mandate is open with a historical report that was the one on poverty and human rights in the Americas. A report that was launched at the end of 2017, where for the first time the Commission decides that poverty is a human rights situation And for my mandate in terms of human rights, it is the most serious and urgent matter of our region. So in that report, the Commission referred the need of advocating for tax policies to orient towards human rights. The same thing we are also doing in the approach to the response of the Commission before the pandemic, which is a comprehensive response with a focus on right to health. And of course, in identifying how the pandemic is unequally affecting collectives that are in vulnerable situations, and very especially people living in poverty. Our resolution, especially the UN, via 2020, also has this very clear calling to redistribution to tax justice. On the other hand, I would like to show how the report in human rights, which is the first in its type of the system and that was under my mandate, also emphasizes on tax policies and the state's decision to prevent corporate capture corporate capture. And in this sense, there's also some precedents that show that the Inter-American Commission has a clear will to move forward in this theme. Hence, I don't know if universalizing would go to a more global axis. So globalizing this content in the language that, of course, the Commission has as of its own standards and mechanisms is a progressed process. And as you very well know, I am very interested in, as of this new strategic agenda and as of discussions and alliances to promote a possible solution by the Inter-American Commission in these same topics that will be enriched, of course, with the principles and guidelines that you are offering. So it is a road that has been started being walked, and we are going to continue hand in hand with it. So hopefully I answer the question. Thank you so much, Soledad. We would like to thank all of the organizations involved in these initiatives. We have felt a lot of support from Redesca, and we are very glad to know that there is a possibility for a very formal support on behalf of the Commission through resolutions or any other type of support. Soledad. So now we switch to English.
I'm now going to speak in English. I'm now going to address Olivier, who has also been a great ally in this work. Olivier, as I mentioned, is the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. His mandate is probably one of the few mandates, or certainly one of the mandates within the UN system that has most directly addressed the issue of fiscal policy and its relevance to eliminating poverty and realizing rights. So Olivier, my question to you would be, how do you see these principles? And I'm fully aware that you may not have had much time to digest them because they were just born this week. But how do you see these principles, this initiative, advancing your mandate's efforts to link rights and resources?
Thank you very much indeed, Ignacio. And let me first of all express my very sincere gratitude to you personally, to the Center for Economic and Social Rights, to the Tax Justice Network, and to all the organizations who contributed to this effort. I think it's a tremendous achievement. And I'd like to answer your question, but first highlight the three reasons why I think these principles and guidelines for human rights in fiscal policy are so important. The first reason is very simply that they provide guidance on a topic that is often misunderstood. Taxation in fact serves three objectives in general as described by governments and understood by parliaments. First, they seek to allow the state to collect public revenue. Secondly, they seek to influence behavior by providing the right economic incentives. And thirdly, they seek to redistribute wealth when they are progressive enough. Now, each of these three functions have a direct relationship to human rights, but I think these principles for human rights and fiscal policy make them more clear, these relationships, and allow us, human rights advocates, to look at fiscal reforms, fiscal policies in place with the benefit of having this framework. In addition, beyond those three functions of fiscal policy I just outlined, there's a fourth one that the principles for human rights and fiscal policy puts forth, which I think is really important and often underestimated, and that is to ensure democratic self-determination by ensuring that there will be adequate political representation in fiscal decision-making processes. And that is what Principle 5.5 is about, and I think it's a very useful addition. The second reason why these principles are so important and timely is because at last, action is being taken at international level to allow countries to make choices with respect to the priorities they set for themselves in reforming their taxation systems. For many years, since literally 40 years, countries have been quasi-sovereign in this area. Why? Well, because they were competing to attract investment, to create a business-friendly environment, and they were doing so in a context in which the race to the bottom in the area of corporate taxation in particular was actually making it very difficult for them to make sovereign choices. Now, thanks to the initiatives developed under the guidance of the G20 by the OECD, the base erosion, profit shifting, inclusive framework, bringing together some 135 countries, we are now finally making progress on this front. And governments have understood that it is extraordinarily costly for them to maintain in place a system in which countries are competing to attract investors and competing by lowering corporate income tax rates. Now, this is important for two reasons and directly relevant to the principles on human rights and fiscal policy. First, because it shows the huge importance of extraterritorial obligations in taxation policies, and that is very welcome in a context in which the CEDAW Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has been sometimes criticized because, as you may recall, Ignacio, the CEDAW Committee challenged Switzerland because the tax haven in Switzerland and the bank secrecy legislation in particular deprived countries in the global south from revenues needed to finance public services and to therefore reduce the burden on women. And the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which I had the honor of serving in 2015, 2020, we addressed this issue when we looked at the UK and the tax havens under UK's jurisdiction, when we looked at the Mauritius Island, which had a very aggressive corporate income tax policy, in fact, leading to a race to the bottom in this area of Africa. And I'm delighted that Principle 13.3 of the principles addresses extraterritorial obligations. I think it's really important. Today, we are in a unique moment in which countries are finally regaining some control over that taxation, and the principles will be extremely useful for this reason. And the third reason why they're important is this. We are celebrating in a month the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, endorsed in 2011 by the Human Rights Council. Now, these principles, however important they are almost entirely silent on this question of taxation and tax avoidance by companies. In fact, an author, Shane Darcy, published in 2017 an article titled "The Elephant in the Room: Corporate Tax Avoidance and Business and Human Rights," showing this silence of the guiding principles on this issue. So it's time to move to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights 2.0 that will be looking at issues such as tax justice, social inclusion, environmental sustainability, and the associated duties of companies. I welcome these principles as a major contribution to that effort to provide guidance to companies. And finally, Ignacio, I answer in a minute to your question. The principles on human rights in fiscal policy, I think, can penetrate the UN human rights system, especially if the Tax Justice Network, if the Center on Economic and Social Rights continue to advocate for their visibility, a bit like the consortium on extraterritorial obligations in the field of human rights managed to do. It takes time. It's worth putting more efforts into promoting these. And I can assure you that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights shall benefit a lot from relying on these principles, because for the moment, the committee does not know what to ask countries when looking at their fiscal policies. And so the committee focuses on levels of inequality, levels of extreme poverty, for example, but not at the causes for these inequalities and this poverty being perpetuated. As to special rapporteurs, the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, these principles will allow them to send letters to governments and to parliaments, as we increasingly do. We call this open letters that are discussing fiscal reform. And this will be a way to influence legislative processes. And in country missions, in country visits, these principles will be extremely useful to ask the right questions to our interlocutors and assess the compatibility with their human rights obligations of the fiscal policies that they put in place. So many thanks indeed for doing this. I look forward to continuing our collaboration and to working with these principles. Thank you.
Wonderful, Olivier. Thank you so much for those insights into strategy for getting broader UN engagement around these principles and opportunities, very practical opportunities that we should definitely put on the agenda of this initiative going forward. I particularly welcome your bringing out the relevance of extraterritorial obligations, something that those of us behind the principles were very keen to introduce strong and clear guidance and language on, and also the relevance to filling the gaps in the guiding principles on business and human rights, which many of us working on issues of corporate taxation have been very aware of. And the 10th anniversary of the principles is definitely a wonderful opportunity to insert the content of the principles to hopefully produce a 2.0, or indeed to feed into the binding treaty process, which is underway at the UN. Excellent. So I would like to move to Irene Ovonji-Odida, who, as I mentioned earlier, is a member of the CRICT Commission, as well as the UN's high-level FACTI panel. Irene, in what ways do you see that these principles can support the key fiscal accountability shifts and reforms that ICRICT and FACTI are pushing for? I have another follow-up question for you, but I want you to answer that one first.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. It's been a really interesting panel, just listening to those who were speaking before me. And I think I agree with all the stuff that they've talked about, and many of the interventions already made respond in part, to this question that you put to me. I'll apologize because there seems to be some background noise where I am outside. Some emergency vehicle, something like that. I hope it won't resume. But just coming to this question, what ICRICT and FACTI have in common is a vision, for global tax justice, for progressive fiscal policies, and for genuine commitment by the international community and by states, particularly the more powerful states currently within the international community, situated in the advanced economies, to genuinely commit to sustainable development. And through that, for them to show this, through the priority that they give in policies, in international cooperation, in spending, that supports the global public interest, public interest both within their countries, but also at a global level, because the issues of inequality that these principles speak to and that this week has focused on are issues of inequality both within and between countries. And as has already been said, I think it was Soledad or Gabi, it is really countries in the global south that are primarily impacted by these inequalities and who face a paradox where you have on the ground in all these countries in the global south, whether you're talking about Africa, Latin America or Asia, you have that paradox where the countries have a huge resource endowment, natural resource endowment, or as well as human, capacities and resource endowment. But at the same time, they're in a situation of perpetual impoverishment. I prefer to talk about it as impoverishment, to reflect that it's not just a status, of say of poverty, but there are actions, policies, decisions that are made that lead to that condition. So this condition arises from actual decisions that are made. So both for ICRIT and for FACTI, we have very specific positions, and in the case of FACTI, recommendations around inclusive global governance, in the global financial system, and recommendations that ICRIT has espoused for several years now relating to the ABC of taxation. So for FACTI, we've also taken that, and called explicitly for a global pact that should be looking at global financial integrity that is premised on values, key values like legitimacy, like transparency, like accountability, and that looks at the problem holistically and solutions holistically. So dealing with illicit financial flows and work against that, not in separate silos, that look at, say, taxation separately from the criminal and corrupt practices, but as a whole ecosystem. And so that is shared very much with what you see in the principles. So the principles reflect the idea of values, that there's certain core values that should influence principles, and that these principles should cut across, and there should not be a separation between looking at the human rights sphere and the fiscal policy sphere, but there's an interconnection between them. And these values should permeate fiscal instruments at different levels. So at global level, say with the Bretton Woods Institution instruments, which recently the FTC tracker talked about, and how even in a time of COVID, those instruments still presuppose, still have assumptions behind them around the core role of markets, to shape development, as opposed to the role of states as the key development actors. So those kind of assumptions still permeate global policy and global instruments. And these principles are a reminder that there needs to be cohesion and coherence in all different spheres, whether in the financial or economic sector and human rights and justice and so on, that is hinged on values that lead to sustainable and inclusive development in countries and between countries. So I think they're quite important as well. For me, another really important thing, premise behind this is, and there was a reference to this by Olivia, and I think the speaker before you, when you who talked about what have the past 40 years been about. And I think for me, one of the big elephants in the room, I would say, is just about the whole neoliberal ideology that has driven and shaped policies at government level and at international level, increasingly creeping, I would say, into international institutions. We see the reach into the UN itself, of corporations. So this whole thinking around neoliberalism and the shaping of state policies and international cooperation by that is one of the major challenges that we have. Hiding and behind it, we have vested interest and that nexus between global elites and state elites, on the political side and on the corporate side. So these principles, I think, bring together the idea of accountability for states and for corporate actors, and they create a framework that can be used to put a spotlight on the actions that they take, the policies that they make, and where they fall short in their commitment and responsibility to citizens, to the whole of community, and particularly to those groups that have been marginalized, that Soledad talked about as well, the groups, collective groups that have been marginalized and structurally disadvantaged by decisions taken around fiscal policy. So I think there's a lot, but of course, at the end of the day, what I always feel is what on the one hand, we have to have the frameworks which shape the thinking and the conceptualizing the ideas. What is development? And this is what these principles do. The next important thing becomes the application of that. So the action that's taken, the advocacy that's taken is really critical. And that needs to be advocacy that brings together a coalition. I'm glad that in the process of developing these, there were coalitions that brought in social movements as well. So the bridging of the fiscal and human rights community, but also social movements, because ultimately decisions of this sort and change and reform comes from two places. The first of all is understanding, but the second of all is commitment. So recognition that there's a need for change is a political action. It's a political step. And all too often we know from our work that political step comes in response to power. So the push has to be backed up by the power of the collective, by the power of what is right, but also the power of the collective and the pressure that comes from social movements and different sort of action is also quite critical. The last point I'd want to make before going to your second question really is that too many times in our spaces, we are talking to ourselves. And so we use language and terminology, even sometimes frameworks, that the rest of society, especially those impacted, cannot relate to. So we need to unpack these things, simplify them, and package them in a way that brings on board those directly impacted. In this case, you've made the attempts to include, groups that are working on racial injustice, groups looking at gender inequality, and many other, personal disability, the indigenous community, all of these. How do we ensure in the dissemination, in the advocacy, that these things connect to the concrete realities that they face and in language that is relevant to them and usable by them? So that I think is one of the key things, so that in the action moving forward, they need to be the drivers because they understand their realities and they have a power that those not directly affected will often not have. And this is why often when we see major changes, even at the global level, in the principles and policies, it is the intervention of groups, the women's movement, for example, the feminist movements, which have pushed and gotten changes, around gender equality, or groups affected by racial inequality who can push and get that, because they will do it in ways that you and I may not be willing to do, because for them, there is no plan B. So we also have to look at that. How are they at the heart of these things, and how do the languages and frameworks we use enable that and enable the harnessing of the power that they already have? Because this is ultimately about political choices.
Thank you so much, Irene. Really welcome you taking us into the sphere of strategy. We've done a phenomenal piece of work. By we, I don't mean just CSR and the 6 organizations we've been working with. This is really a collective process that has been nourished and informed by civil society groups, social movements, the indigenous movement, feminist movements, Afro-descendant movements in the region. We've done a fantastic job in the articulation of norms, but now is the time to think strategically about how we activate these norms, how we bring them into the sphere of public policy and public debate. So I really welcome the ideas that you've thrown out there as to how we might do so. Let me just, before moving on to our next guest, just a couple of logistical points. We have, as my colleagues Maria Emilia and Sergio have said in the chat, we have a Google Doc which you can find in the chat and can link to, that enables you and encourages you to post ideas, materials, also to say who you are. Please fill that in if you can. Secondly, we welcome questions. I know I'm not taking individual questions to each panelist right now, but if we have time at the end, I certainly will take questions. So please put any questions that you have in the chat. Thank you to those who've already made some. And just to say that Olivier and Gabby unfortunately have to leave us due to other commitments. Thank you, Olivier. Thank you, Gabby. I understand Gabby may try to reconnect later before the end of the session, but just to explain that they haven't just disappeared for random reasons or technical reasons. So on this same strategic note and tone, I want to move to Derege Alemayehu, who is as I mentioned, the executive coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Derege, in describing it, but like a federation of tax justice advocates in different regions, which includes the Red de Justicia Fiscal, which has been a very active, played a super active role in this initiative in Latin America. And I wanted to ask you, Derege, how relevant you see these principles and the initiative behind them to struggles that tax justice advocates are waging in other regions, and particularly in the global South. And if they're relevant, what adaptations might you want to see to maximize their usefulness in different contexts?
Okay, thank you very much, Ignacio, for this invitation. I'm really very happy that our member, Red Justicia Fiscal, has been part of this movement. The Global Alliance is, as I said, an alliance of 5 independent continental tax justice networks in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and North America. And this initiative awakens again our ambition about 4 years ago to have CSR and Global Alliance as co-conveners of a global working group on bringing tax justice and human rights into the same fold. It is a very important thing. And now this ambition is awakened by this initiative, and I'm happy that it has started in Latin America, and we'll have to push the initiative into an international, because the problems are similar, the contexts are similar, the structures reproducing all these injustices are similar everywhere. So this is a very important task. About the relevance of the principles elaborated in your we might ask the reverse. What has meant the absence of such principles in the fiscal policies up to today? As we know, fiscal policies in many regions, or almost universally, are based on the neoliberal principle of trickle-down economics, which says if you leave the money with the rich, they will create employment and do away with poverty. The second one is it is based on business decisions on the principles of shareholder value and profit maximization. This is what has brought us where we are now. So basing these policies on human rights principles means changing the very foundation of the global financial and financial system as well. So in that sense, I look at it in 2 ways. One is, how can we use this initiative to bring it upwards and make it a universal thing that can govern, that can inform policies at the national level, fiscal policy at the national level. For this, there is no other alternative other than having it as a UN document. All universal declarations are emanating from the UN have been very useful. So we have been demanding for a long time a UN tax convention and a UN tax commission to elaborate on these issues. So pushing it fiscal policy is very important. When we look at financial policy issues, we have also to look at inequalities between nations, not only within nations. And these inequalities are being reproduced. And it is not possible to overcome inequality in developing countries without reducing the inequality among nations. What causes this inequality? What reproduces the inequality? It is the obscene reversed flow of resources from poor countries to rich countries. It is about stopping this. The other thing is, when you talk about rights, it is also about rights of developing countries to tax global profit, which originate in their nations. Now what's happening at this moment is, there is another pink club of the rich, which is now dictating rules on other countries and marginalizing the UN. OECD cannot be the rule maker, the standard setter of global norms. It is a club of the rich. So we have to use this, this opportunity to bring it forward and then to make it a UN document so that it underlies the UN tax convention. That is one of it. When coming to bringing it to the South, there are certain shortcomings of our own which we have to overcome. We are used to working in silos. When we started the tax justice movement in Africa, it was very difficult for us even to bring those working on budgets in alliance with us. They were looking at budget. They were looking at corruption. They were not at the starting period ready to look at the revenue side. So it is a matter of overcoming these silos. But these silos are being reinforced by the way we are being funded as well. We get most of our resources from the North. They tell you that they give you a program and you say, no, you cannot go out of it. How many problems do we have to sometimes have capacity for overlapping issues? So there are some structural, some thinking we have to do. How can we come together to generate resources for overlapping and overarching issues and work together? Streamline our resources to work together. This is also a very important thing, because there is everyone feels the necessity of these principles as underlying principles, as overarching principles. But as long as we continue to work in silos, we cannot overcome them. So we have to also change our way of thinking, our way of working, our way of fundraising, so that these fundamental overlapping issues are also covered. That we stop working in silos and work towards the convergence of rights movements, justice movements, so that we can together change the structural situation. So this is a very welcome opportunity. As I said, we have the task of anchoring it in other continents as well, this initiative. But we have also the duty of bringing it together and make it also an instrument, a tool for changing international level happenings and ways of working as well. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Deraje. And I hope we can count on you and on all the networks that are part of the Global Alliance precisely to take that task forward, to globalize these principles, to adapt them, to get much greater ownership of them in different parts of the world, and also to continue silo busting, which is what this initiative really has aimed to do. It's ironic that you talk even of silos within movements for fiscal justice, you know, the tax versus the budget justice activists. It's the same in the human rights movement. There are many silos even within the human rights movement. And these principles are so cross-cutting. They're so crucial to so many struggles for not just fiscal justice and human rights, but for racial justice, for gender justice, for the struggle to end global inequality. So we look forward to working with GATJ and other partners in that silo busting task. So let me, on that note, move to Alex, the Tax Justice Network, a long-term partner of CSR in crossing the bridge from tax justice to human rights. Alex, one of the phenomenal things that EJ has done is advancing on the kind of normative and narrative fronts. In other words, you have, as I think it was Irene that mentioned, you have advanced on principles around tax justice, the ABC norms, but you've also done a spectacular job, I think, in shifting the public narrative and the understanding around tax, why tax matters, and moving that debate beyond the technocratic or beyond the choir of progressive sectors, and really making it a more popular, a shift in the popular debate. So my question to you is, because it would be so useful for our process to understand, to glean some insights from your experience, how do you get new norms to translate into new narratives? You know, how can we make this normative initiative also have an impact in terms of shifting the broader narrative? What insights can you share from your experience?
That's a great question, and a very unreasonable one, because if we were so good at doing it, we'd have won already. But let me try and say something on it. But first of all, actually, let me just say what an honour to be part of such a great panel, but also congratulations on the principles. I mean, they are, I really think, a really important and striking achievement to bring that together, to cover the range of issues and aspects in it, with the breadth of people involved in it, and get to something so clear and so strong. And I really do think these are going to be a key part of the advocacy agenda, and of setting and shifting norms and narratives over the next period. And we'll certainly be embracing them. Thinking about the Tax Justice Network within this, when my predecessor, John Christensen, set up the Tax Justice Network in 2003, there were a couple of important things, well, a whole number of them, but to pick out two. So one was that he and colleagues drafted the first accounting standard for country-by-country reporting. So this very technical measure to get the kind of transparency from multinationals that allows you to at least see the degree of profit shifting in which countries are winning and losing. Very niche, and very few people really, even now, but certainly then, kind of engaged with the technical detail of that. But at the same time, John had this idea, and it's a commitment that's kind of driven us ever since, that our role wasn't and isn't to get individual policy changes in individual country cases. It's to, as he puts it, it's to change the weather, right? If you get a policy in place, but nobody's really bought the reason why, then the policy either won't be made effective, or it will get turned over the next year and it won't travel any further. What matters is to shift the narratives that people have in their heads. So, we began fighting narratives of, it is smart to pay less tax, right? That's just good business. When Donald Trump said that, trying to get elected in 2016, there was this kind of very widespread intake of breath. Did he? I mean, he still got elected, fair enough. But if he'd said that in 2003, nobody would have batted an eyelid. We had our, George Osborne, who was later to become the UK Chancellor, on TV explaining to people as an MP how not to pay inheritance tax. And nobody really thought that was kind of a bad thing. That was just being smart to pay less tax, right? So changing those narratives. And the other side of that, if you like, is the narrative that says, the problems of corruption and of weak government, these are problems of poor countries. And, as it happens, insert history of empire here, as it happens, also countries that are not majority white. And that's really an issue that they need to deal with. Starting to unpick that and to understand that we have these global structures driven by empire and the legacies of empire, of tax havenery, that suck out both the tax revenues, but also, and more importantly, the ability of states to be representative, to work for their people. That's crucial. And we're not there yet on that. But if you look at the FACTI panel, for example, that's kind of a pivotal moment in that sort of understanding of the world beginning to really spread, and with it the kind of the arguments for shifts in the global architecture, as Irene has talked about, and as Derege said, it's about moving away from, for example, the OECD, the group of rich countries, setting tax rules for everyone, and then telling some lower income countries that they're not doing it very well and it's their fault. Come on. So it's the narratives that really ultimately shift, as we understand the world in different ways, the whole context in which we then make policies in individual countries, in individual moments, and how that's sustained is much more important. And what I think the principles can do is really, really strengthen one particular shift, which is away from seeing tax as primarily economic and about incentives. Do we do it a little bit more? Ooh, but then will people invest a little bit less? I'm not sure. Where's the trade-off here? The very narrow economist questions that we often get lost in, to instead saying, no, there are some absolutes here, some absolute human rights that are demanded of us and by us, and that tax is merely a piece of how we get there. It is about raising money, and there may be some trade-offs involved in that. But as I think Olivier said, it's also about the political relationships. It is the most marginalized peoples who tend to pay the highest share of their income in tax, but they pay the lowest share in direct taxes on incomes and profits and so on. And that means they don't have the same sense of tax citizenship. They don't feel the government spending their money, and they don't hold governments to account. Whereas people at the top end of the income and wealth distributions are paying typically much smaller shares of their income in tax, but it's direct tax, and they feel it. They think the government is spending their money, and so they are politically empowered. So our tax systems aren't just failing to deal with economic inequality, they're actually exacerbating political inequality at the national level, as well as, for these kind of imperial reasons, globally. So understanding that tax is political, that tax is about rights, not about marginal economic changes, is really crucial. And if there's one big narrative that I take from the principles, it's that, aside from all of the individual very important things they're saying, it's that shift.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. I think we might have to enlist you in our narrative crafting around the principles. Those insights are so helpful in understanding, not just helping us understand the value of these principles, but also in strategizing about how we might bring about those broader narrative shifts. Those have been phenomenally rich interventions. I want to turn to some of the questions that we've been receiving in the chat. We have at least 3. My colleagues will tell me if there are more than 3. So Neil Coleman, a close ally from the Institute for Economic Justice in South Africa, has asked a question in the chat around corporate taxation, particularly how to deal with and respond to President Biden's proposal, which has now been reduced from a minimum of 21% tax on corporations to 15%. How can the panelists comment on this, and what the vehicles are in multilateral bodies to practically advance this discussion? Matti Kohonen, another close ally from the Financial Transparency Coalition, has also weighed in on this question. So that's one question to the panelists. There is also a question from Livy Gerbaz, another close ally and indeed a partner of this initiative from INESC in Brazil, one of the 7 organizations that has steered this initiative. And she asks, how do we connect the fight for fiscal justice with the financialization process? And the third question that I've seen in the chat is from Claudio Schuftan, also a close ally, founder of the People's Health Movement, based in, I believe, in Vietnam. Claudio asks, what have we done to engage with parliamentarians and with the lawmakers, with the people entrusted to change fiscal policies in different countries as an important constituency? If there are other questions that I've missed, please forgive me, but I'm not going to ask each of you to respond to all of those questions. I just want to invite you, any of you who want to respond on any one of those questions, to do so briefly, if possible. Who wants to weigh in on the corporate tax question and how to respond to the Biden proposal? Alex, I see you lighting up. And there is it.
As I've posted an answer in the chat, perhaps I should let Derege have a shot.
Sure, Derege.
So no, it is a good idea that Alex give me the precedence, because I was to answer to his tweets, and I'll do that. At any rate, what I'm saying is there is a very exaggerated glorification of the Biden plan. The small prints are not out. It is only the things that are interesting for some which are being capitalized. It is not now the reduction of the 21 to 15%, which is important. The scope of companies to be within the reform have been reduced to 100. B, there are efforts to stop unilateral measures if countries don't agree with the minimalist agreements which are being negotiated at the OECD. Then the Biden plan is also to discourage unilateral action of countries by proposing a binding, non-negotiable dispute resolution mechanisms. C, the Biden plan leaves the artificial split of residual and routine profits proposed by the OECD. It is a technical jargon. What does it mean? Only about 10% of global multinational profits will be allocated. It's not about the recognition of taxing rights of nations. It's about allocating 10% of global, with using. And now, for us to clamor, this is victory, where only a section of it is being, the allocation of which is going to be changed is not fair. So the third one is so much propaganda, but it is not even sure that it can be passed by the UN Senate and by the UN Congress. So what I'm saying is, please don't disarm developing countries at this crucial negotiation by promising what Biden is not promising. I am worried about because if everybody says the Biden plan is a breakthrough, it will disarm developing countries. For example, ATAF, the Africa Tax Administration Forum, proposed to do away with the split of residual and routine profit and lump together the global profit. This has been proposed by ATAF. It is not within the Biden proposal. So what I'm saying is, okay, 12.5% was in the deal, now 15%. An increase of 2.5% can be considered tremendous, which is not in my case the case. But at any rate, the whole package should be seen together. The legitimization of the OECD as a rule-making organization through this process should be always considered. So I am warning. I'm saying, please don't disarm those countries like Argentina who are putting their feet down to not to accept some of the excesses being negotiated at the inclusive forum. And don't forget, rule-making should go to the UN. It should not be in the hands of a club of countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Derege. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this, the corporate tax question? Alex?
Just briefly, sorry, I'll be quick. I mean, I think that there is a kind of a glass half full version of this. I agree with lots of Derege's concerns, of course, but I feel fairly optimistic now that we have the FACTI panel. We have increasingly the fiscal affairs researchers at the International Monetary Fund. We have the European Commission. We have a great many smaller people like ourselves, but also important groups like the African Tax Administrators Forum, calling for something, and the G24 group, that sounds increasingly like the answer is two things. It's a global minimum corporate tax that is effective and has a reasonably high rate, And it's a shift away from transfer pricing to unitary taxation with formulary apportionment. We're not getting there at the OECD, certainly not this time. And I think increasingly everyone recognises this is going to have to be a UN process, even those who'd rather it wasn't for their own bad reasons. But it feels like that consensus is only strengthening. So we're not getting there this summer. There'll be some progress. We'll see how much it is. But it feels to me like we are on the road, that the narratives, if you like, have shifted, even though we haven't yet got the policies in place. So I am starting to feel, at the risk of tempting fate, like, we might be on the good path here.
Ignacio?
Soledad or Irene? Yes, Irene, please.
Yes, just adding to that, and just agree with what Derek and Alex have said, that there is the venue, the forum for this kind of negotiation is to move to the UN, and there are opportunities upcoming in the course of the year, including targeting the UN General Assembly resolutions and so on that need to be done. But what I would also emphasize is the resistance, and I think Alex has spoken partly to that, the resistance to that. So the existence of recommendations by FACTI by itself will not create the change. It's the work that is done by the tax justice community and other actors from a human rights perspective, including with insiders, supportive insiders in government, in the delegations to the UN. And within the UN itself, that kind of work needs to be done because there is significant pushback from OECD, and there's significant pressure to the UN itself, this UN system, against those recommendations. And the FACTI process itself is over. We've done our report, we've handed it in. We are continuing to do advocacy and so on, but this is not as a panel. The panel itself, the mandate ended in February once the report was handed in. So to get those processes and to take advantage of those processes, we need work done. And civil society typically has been really critical in that, both during the process itself. Many of you here on this call played a major role within that process. And just taking lessons from the Becky panel process, that the synergies between what the technical expertise and global reach of civil society, working with allies within governmental institutions, states, state delegations, and within the international system or the institution like the UN in this case, where these kind of reforms need to go, are really important. In the FACTI process, for example, there was a lot of that kind of interaction, between us as individual panelists with, support networks such as those who are here. And linking that to delegations, so ensuring that there's clarity in delegations. Last point, and I think ICRIT has done some work around this, but it's something that we need to do. The points that Reggie is making are really critical. What are the actual benefits in terms of a policy space and governance and actual tax, increased revenues to governments that will come from these proposals? So that interrogation and the evidence around that is important. Many smaller nations do not have the capacity, financial, to do that kind of research that breaks down the impact of the proposals coming from the OECD. And some work has been done around that by some of the groups here. I think TJN and others within ICRIT have done that. Sharing that kind of evidence with governments is important for them to see what do the OECD proposals actually mean for revenues and the allocation of taxing rights and revenues between countries. That kind of thing in real time, I think will be important. With the Becky panel, one of the reasons why the AU took the issue up, and a Council of Finance Ministers, who we know notoriously, how they really are not often the way you go if you're looking for progressive groups, right? So finance ministers very much focused on Bretton Woods kind of thinking. But one of the reasons why they took that step to set up the Becky panel, which I was a member of, was because of the evidence that was brought to them by civil society and by the Economic Commission for Africa on the cost of illicit financial flows to their revenues. So going back to the issue of narratives that Alice talked about, information, evidence of the real cost to the status quo, to the lack of inclusive governance, and to those tax allocation proposals coming out of the OECD matter. I would have liked to mention earlier, and it's the last point I'll talk about, really, as we talk about the positives that may have come out of the OECD process, or processes of that sort, it's important to see how they impact on different countries. So if you have systems that promote more information exchange, but those systems only work for some countries and are not open and accessible to all countries, the net effect of it is to actually create more inequality between the situation of those who have the access and those countries that don't. So the importance of the universal solutions and of breaking down the impact at a regional and country level is what I want to underline.
Thank you so much, Irene. Soledad, I know you wanted to come in on this earlier. Apologies. Soledad, please. On this or on any of the questions that have been asked. ¿Puedes responder sobre esta pregunta o cualquiera de las preguntas que se han hecho?
Perfecto, no, mucho mejor así.
Yes, perfect. No, it's great like that, being able to have heard the interesting answers by Alex and Irene. And Derje, I learned a lot, and my reflection actually was about how important it is to have these sort of proposals and how necessary it is that now that we have more possibilities to articulate efforts and that we have more tools, because we have more tools to apply them from a human rights perspective to tax justice. So we are going to be able maybe to have a monitoring activity, and we are going to be kind of an observatory where all of these alerts or topics that deserve a discussion, an interdisciplinary elaborated discussion, could be in some way maybe not centralized, but systematized. And in this sense, I just wanted to share a message of openness from my mandate. I am very interested, as of this question, to receive information. I mean, US is a world champion at an economic level, and it is also a state member of the OAS. So we are providing some follow-up to their policies and their measures. So I'd like to also share with the colleagues our contact info. We're open to receiving information with the main goal of being able to monitor and to put in practice standards that are recent for the Commission, but especially as of social explosions in Latin America, especially in 2019, we have started to be more sensible and active in these matters. For example, tax reforms and reforms that have to do with austerity and that affect social spending in a dramatic way, especially now that we are in a pandemic. These are topics that we are monitoring, and we need a lot of help for that. So I just wanted to share this message of openness and willingness, and we need the support of civil society and specialized civil society in those matters so that we can work efficiently and also in a way that's smart and that helps generate the right discussion and consensus. So you already talked about the OECD, our own report on companies and human rights, that in some way at an inter-American level, it ends up replacing that gap that Shooter was mentioning in terms of the silence of the guiding principles in terms of tax situations. Our report is quite clear. It does not only have an inter-American point of view that's focused on this topic, talking about the need to fight corruption and capturing the state with all of what this entails. We have also developed an inter-American context that is concerned from the information that they received on tax policies and companies' tax behaviors and their influence in public spending. So it is in English, and I would like to share it with you. And I think it is very important to stress that our report and the recommendations that we do are targeting American states, but also companies and financial players, international ones. So I think it's the right time to consider your standards so we can take into account these players, not to monitor only, but to start a conversation that approaches both worlds and that also allow to start an idea. And the Special Rapporteur on External Debt from the UN has been promoting several ideas that are very important. One of them is the need for all of the measures taken, whether it's positive or not so positive, have an impact assessment on human rights. And I think that this is also a core problem of the efforts that we need to carry out in this matter. And Ignacio, it's a huge pleasure
to meet you and to see you on the screen. Bye bye. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Soledad. I'm going to switch back to English. We have only 3 minutes left for this event. Now, there were other questions about parliamentarians, about financialization. Claudio made a follow-up question with characteristic wit. Where in the cemetery lies the Tobin tax? And we also had the most meta question of all from Mati Kohonen about is tax abuse human rights abuse? A phrase that we in CSR have used very often, but also asking how can we leverage human rights norms in practical ways to hold multilateral bodies accountable. In the 2 minutes remaining, we have other business to do before we wrap up. However, I would draw your attention to the helpful links and information that my colleague Sergio has provided in the chat in response to some of these questions. There are links to additional documents. There were a series of background documents, analytical documents on various topics that informed the principles. I would draw your attention to those. They cover some of the topics that people have asked in these questions. So in the time remaining, I also want to remind you to put any additional comments in the document that was sent, the Google document that was shared around. Maria Emilia has just resent that link in the chat. Your comments and suggestions are extremely useful to us. I'm sorry that we couldn't have 3 hours instead of 1.5 hours to cover all these topics. I want to end with a note of huge thanks, first and foremost, to the wonderful panelists today. We could not have hoped for a more impressive and more authoritative panel. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Soledad. Thank you, Olivier. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Derege. And thank you, Alex. This has been a very strategic session. We take lots of inputs that the steering group and the broader alliance around this initiative will feed on and ruminate on as we plan the next steps for this work. I also want to give a particular shout of thanks to the 6 organizations in the steering group of this initiative, along with CSR. That's CELS in Argentina, De Justicia in Colombia, Fundar in Mexico, INESCI in Brazil, and the Red de Justicia Fiscal. I hope I am not missing any out. A particular word of thanks to Fundar and ASIG in Argentina. Thank you, Kate, for reminding me. I normally go in alphabetical order, and I started with CELS. Mil disculpas, ASIG. I also want to give a particular word of thanks to Fundar to our colleagues Alba, Paulina, Ivan, Mariana, Alicia, Aide, for all the support and close coordination with CSR in the organization of this week of events on human rights and fiscal justice. Mil gracias, Fundar. A huge word of thanks to the committee of experts, too many to mention here, but you can find them on the links, the wonderful experts from across the region, from the spheres of human rights, fiscal justice, indigenous rights, Afro-descendant rights, who've steered the formulation and articulation of these norms. And I want to give a special thanks to the CSR team in Latin America that has led this work. My colleague Sergio Chaparro in Bogota, who has done a phenomenal job of coordinating this process, a lot of the heavy lifting intellectually, but also a lot of the careful weaving of the alliance, which has been so successful. But also I want to mention my other colleagues in Latin America in the CSR team, Mayra Baez, who has done the communications for this initiative, also in Bogota, and then my two colleagues in Argentina, Olivia Minata and Maria Emilia Mamberti, who've both done a lot of also the intellectual heavy lifting and drafting and coordination around the principles. I also want to mention this sounds like the Oscars, I'm sorry, but I also want to give a shout out to the technical team that has helped us today. Santiago, I think all of us were Santiago today at one point or another, almost literally, because his name appeared in our screens. But also the other members of the technical team, I think Natalia, who was also working with us today, the interpreters, Galia, Paula, and sorry, I'm blanking on the other name. Let me thank the three interpreters. Also our visual graphic rapporteurs, Carolina O'Reilly and Andrea Medina, not Molina. And I want to invite Andrea to show us the visual representation of the discussions today. Andrea, ¿podrías decir un par de cosas guiarnos un poco? Could you guide us through this, your visual?
Please.
Hola, buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. So basically, we have the main ideas of the conversation here. This, we have, of course, the principles and how from the seed in Latin America, we have been permeating it towards the other countries of the global south, and the importance of how human rights and fiscal justice are weaving together, and the need of the presence of the most affected communities, such as women, indigenous communities, as well as the importance of translating all of these analyses and to have a clearer notion of their realities so that there can be a proper change. And the invitation to keep having this discussion and joint effort so that we could take into account, and we have also to create a series of impacting changes so we can have a more comprehensive effort. Thank you very much, Andrea, for this visualization of the wealth of this discussion. Your work is amazing by capturing ideas, the main ideas, and the reivindicative aspect of this conversation. So
it remains for me just to thank everybody here. I didn't say the names completely of the interpreters. I really want to give them thanks. Galia, Paula, and Luz. Luz Maria was the name that I was missing. We really appreciate your work, and we know how difficult it is and how you've gone beyond the call of duty, particularly since we've gone 5 minutes beyond time. I hope there's one thing that this leaves you with, and that's excitement and ambition, an excitement to continue the struggle, a recognition of how important this struggle is. This is a boundary-pushing initiative, as I said before, and we will continue to push boundaries from Latin America to the world, from reshaping fiscal policy to basically replacing neoliberalism, to shifting the boundaries within our silos, as Dorothée was mentioning. This is not, this change is not going to happen solely if it's led solely by one movement alone. We have to build alliances across movements. That's exactly what this initiative has tried to do, and we will continue to do so over the years to come. I just hope you will join us all. Thanks again to the wonderful panelists, and thank you all of you for joining from whichever part of the world you have joined us. Thank you, everyone.
¿Sabes cuál es la relación entre la política fiscal y los derechos humanos? Los derechos humanos son los derechos que toda persona tiene por existir. La política fiscal es la forma en la que el gobierno obtiene los recursos.
In which the government receives resources to fund and how they spend it later on. This policy could promote or generate setbacks in guaranteeing human rights. In Latin America, the most unequal region in the world, due to the pandemic, 73 multimillionaires increased their fortune, while 52 million people have already entered poverty situations. This shows that Latin American countries are not meeting the international agreements on human rights that they signed. If these international agreements were met, tax policy would be at the service of people and their rights instead of restricting them, which is what goes on today in the region. With this in mind, 7 organizations in Latin America aim to discuss these international agreements and to clarify what are the implications of rights in tax policies. That's how the 15 principles of human rights in tax policy were created, that when being applied by governments would ensure that tax policies are at the service of rights. Some of the ideas in the document mention that state needs to collect taxes in a just manner in such a way that the richest contribute the most, that women and Afro-descending people, indigenous peoples and communities that have suffered discriminations need to be a priority in spending decision, and that tax policy should be transparent, participative, and subject to accountability. If you want to know more, visit our website.